Okay, here we go. All right, thank you everybody for being here. Welcome again to the HMIS new user training. Today we are learning about the Homeless Management Information System. We're going to start the training today by talking a little bit about the big picture, what HMIS is and why we use it as a community. We will also be talking about the coordinated entry workflow. Coordinated entry is one of many workflows that you might be interacting with in the HMIS system. Coordinated entry is the process through which we connect people experiencing homelessness with resources in a streamlined way. So again, that's just sort of the first workflow that you'll learn. After this training, I'm going to be sending everybody the end user agreement and the privacy training. For those of you that'll be watching this as a recording, you'll have gotten this ahead of time. Once you have watched this training, once you have signed your end user agreement and you've completed the privacy training, you will gain access to HMIS. You'll receive a unique login and password. And at that point, we do ask that you do a test client in HMIS. That's where you get to sort of put everything you've heard here to practice and see if you have any questions, if everything makes sense. From there, you will then email the HMIS help desk, which you'll receive that email in an email after this training. And once you've completed your test client, you will meet with one of the HMIS team members to review the test client together and to talk about any other workflows in HMIS that you might need access to based on the agency you work for and your role in that agency. So let's start by talking again sort of about the big picture. HMIS is a shared database. We currently have, I think, 40 HMIS participating agencies, I think 41 now with the Humane Society, which is super exciting. All of those agencies are participating in preventing or ending homelessness in some capacity. And that can vary very greatly. It might be that they're providing street outreach services. It could be that they're providing rapid rehousing or any other various service. So we use HMIS for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, many of the federal grants that come into the city are actually required to enter their data into HMIS for that specific program work to prove essentially to the grantor about the performance and outcomes of the services that you're providing. Beyond the sort of like compliance piece for grants, HMIS is super important and beneficial for the purpose of understanding homelessness in our community. So it's the one tool that we have to really tell the story of homelessness, to understand how many people are outside or in shelters, and then to advocate for resources to fill the gaps. So your participation serves a lot of purposes. It can connect people to resources. It helps us, again, understand homelessness. And really, we are continuing to move the community in the direction of coordinating by using the data that's available. Any questions so far about sort of why you're here or what we're doing? Okay. Well, one other concept that I want to introduce you to, and I think many of you may have already heard about this or participated in it, that's the continuum of care. So it's sort of another construct, like a theoretical construct, and really it is the geographic region of Nashville-Davidson County. We call it the continuum of care. And really what it is any person, agency, governmental agency that works together to prevent and end homelessness. Similarly to the HMIS construct, it is actually a federal requirement that communities that geographic communities are working together in a systematic way to end homelessness. So basically the COC fulfills that HUD requirement. It makes it easier for us as a community to receive federal dollars. And then again, more importantly than that, it gives us the ability to work together strategically to prevent and end homelessness. So we'll talk about both of those constructs at several points throughout this training. So I just kind of wanted to introduce them both to you. Okay, I am going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Give me multiple seconds. Okay, sorry, y'all. Okay, of course, this is not going to go well for the recorded training. Okay, 1 sec. Okay, phew, here we go. Can someone confirm for me that they can see my screen at this point?
I see it.
Okay, thank you. Amazing. Now that I'm sharing my screen, it's a lot harder for me to see you all. So this is where you just have to be brave and ask your questions. I can't see the chat feature anymore. So again, just throw them out there. So welcome to HMIS. This is what it looks like. I like to start with sort of a visual tour of what you're looking at. So when you log in to HMIS, this is what you're going to see. Up here in the top left corner, you can see that this says WellSky Community Services. WellSky is the software company that we partner with to implement our HMIS. You'll hear people call HMIS WellSky. The old name is Service Point. I know sometimes people call it that too. So just so you guys know, the difference is essentially WellSky is the service software provider, HMIS is the concept, but it's all the same thing. Below that, you'll see, actually, let me quickly choose somebody to shadow. Very randomly, I'm gonna pick Ashley Blum at Park Center just so you guys see what it looks like from the user perspective. Okay, so below WellSky, you can see here that this says Metro Social Services. So that is actually the department in which the Metro Homeless Impact Division lives. And actually, Metro Social Services is named as the HMIS lead agency. What that means is that our team is responsible for training for HMIS, reporting up to the federal government, and then locally sort of making data useful in our community, and much more. So essentially implementing HMIS systematically in Nashville. Below that, when you log in, you will see your agency's name and your logo. So obviously a Park Center employee would see this, but depending on what agency you work at, you'll see your own. Over here in the left-hand side, you'll see the different tabs that you have access to. So you land on your home dashboard, but you'll also primarily be using Client Point. Client Point is how you're going to search for and access client records in HMIS. Depending on your role at your agency, it might be useful to you to use this reporting functionality. Everyone does have access to it, and if you're interested in being able to report on your agency's data, that'll be a supplemental additional training that you'll need to attend so that you just know how to report on things. Everything that you enter in the HMIS becomes reportable and hopefully useful to you in terms of grant applications, understanding the services you're providing, etc. So if you are interested in that, you'll please reach out to the HMIS Help Desk to learn more. In the center of your screen, you'll see some system news. Obviously, there's not a whole lot happening here since we launched our website back in 2020. This website I will link in the follow-up email to you all. This is where we post any document you would ever need for HMIS or coordinated entry. We post lots of training materials here and generally any updates or things like that. If anything big is happening, we also will throw an update in here. So I would recommend you just kind of keep your eye in the center of the screen. If there's anything big happening, it'll be posted here. Up here in the top right corner, I would call this sort of the most important thing in HMIS. These are called your modes. We have a mode called Enter Data As and one called Backdate. And I'm going to be annoyingly emphasizing the importance of these. This is essentially how data is organized in HMIS. When you log into HMIS, you are going to be automatically placed under the umbrella of your agency. So everything that you can see and access will sort of be the agency's work and relevant to your role. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is this thing called Enter Data As. Again, super, super important. I really recommend you write out a sticky note that says, as soon as you log into HMIS, click on Enter Data As. So I'm going to click on Enter Data As. Some people call it EDA mode for short. This is how you're going to tell HMIS which program you are entering data into. If you're not entering somebody into the coordinated entry process, if you're doing your grant work or something like that, or your program work, it'll be really important that you know from your supervisor which EDA mode you should be documenting in. So what you will see when you click on your Enter Data As mode is a list of relevant programs operating at your agency. So here we can see all that are relevant for Park Center. We have a naming convention that we use. So here we have the name of the agency. Sometimes, depending on the agency you work for, it might be an acronym. So for example, here it says Park Center, but the Salvation Army usually says TSA, just for example. The next little piece of the name is going to be what type of project it is. So here this is Park Center, and then SO stands for Street Outreach. We also have RRH, which would be Rapid Rehousing, PSH, Permanent Supportive Housing. This is, again, where I would recommend you sit down or email your supervisor and just make sure that you understand what each of these different programs is so that you're always entering data in the correct program. And then the last piece of the name is going to be a grant if there is a specific grant associated with the program. So here you can see that this Street Outreach program is funded by the ESG grant, the Emergency Solutions Grant. Millions of acronyms. Anyone who's brand new in this field, I'm sure you're being bombarded by acronyms. It'll all come together eventually, but again, a little at a time, just make sure you're sort of piecing together this info. So as I mentioned, today we are focused on learning the coordinated entry workflow. I think it's important to start this training with the coordinated entry workflow because most people are going to be interacting with this workflow at some point when they're working with people experiencing homelessness or a housing crisis. They are either being entered into coordinated entry to receive a service, or sometimes on the back end, you will be receiving clients as a referral from coordinated entry as well. So a lot of interaction with this program. There's also a lot of crossover between the elements required for coordinated entry and the other workflows that you'll be using. So I think it's a pretty comprehensive one to start with. We're going to talk about this one universal ROI a little bit later in the workflow when we get to the release of information tab. This would actually not be a program that you enter data into. Hopefully that'll make more sense in a few minutes when we talk more about the release. So I'm going to click on the green plus sign by coordinated entry, and now we can see up here in the top right corner, we have coordinated entry selected for our EDA mode. So now we've told HMIS, I want to enter someone into coordinated entry. Now that we've done that, we are going to come back over here on the left-hand side and click on client point, which is again where we are going to search for and or create a new client record. Before I move forward, does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. So we are going to create Shanley tests today as a client that we interacted with. This client we met is staying in the car with her daughter. And so we want to make sure that she's enrolled in the coordinated entry program and is going to be on the by name list. We'll talk more about that later for resources. What you can see down here is that this is grayed out. So adding a new client with this information is grayed out because the system really wants you to search for the person to make sure that they're not already in here. We always want to work from an existing record rather than creating multiple records for the same person. So just so you know what that looks like, actually, I'm going to start by searching for Rachel Test. Okay, great. If your client is already in the system, you're going to see them listed down here. Here you can see there are two. Usually or hopefully you'd have date of birth to use as well to distinguish who your client is, etc. But we have one missing. To click and work from this record, I would either click on the name here or this little pencil, and that would open the Rachel record and you would be able to work from that record. So just so you know what that looks like, we are now going to create Shanley Test. This is going to pop up and it's asking, are you sure you searched and you're not creating a duplicate record? Yes, I did. Great. So here we go. We are now in Shanley's record, which we just created. Two things. Before we talk about what backdate mode is, I always point out something that visually threw me off for a long time as I got acquainted to the HMIS software. At many points throughout this software workflow, you're going to see boxes or what we call sub-assessments pulling up on top of the main record. And as you can see here, there's not a whole lot of distinction between the sub-assessment and the background, which again, visually was just really hard for me. So just so you can see, this is a sub-assessment on top of the main record. Okay, now let's talk about backdate mode, which again is correlating to the second most important thing that you're going to do before you enter any data for a client into HMIS. Backdate mode, I want you to think of as simply a timestamp. And this timestamp is going to indicate when information was collected from a client. So just to give you a couple examples, maybe you're sitting with the client right now and you're just using HMIS as your opportunity to ask questions and put it into HMIS real time with the person. You would simply put right now as the backdate mode or timestamp for when that information was collected. Let's say, though, that maybe you met with a person yesterday or last week and you're just now getting around to being able to enter the data. You would just simply, again, put when that information was collected. And for the sake of this example, I want to give myself a little bit of time to work with. So I'm going to say that we met with this client on the 10th of the month. So we always want to keep the like hour, minute, second at 12:01 a.m. That keeps things very organized. The timestamp, we are just primarily concerned about the day that information was collected. So we do recommend that you always keep this as what it auto sets to, which is 12:01 a.m. Okay, I'm going to click Set New Backdate. So I'm establishing in the system that I met with the person on 2/10. Okay, two things just happened. First of all, we can see that both of our modes are now filled out and complete. Again, I'm entering information into the CE coordinated entry program and that I have set my timestamp. The second thing that happens when you set your backdate mode is that these two bars here are going to turn offensively yellow, in my opinion. This is going to be a visual reminder to you whether or not you've set your backdate. So that's how important it is that you just make sure always that you are associating the information with the time in which it was collected. Any questions about either of our modes before we move on? Okie dokie. Well, we're gonna do another visual tour. We have now, as I said, created Shanley a record in HMIS. So we see her name here, and another thing you'll notice is what we call the HMIS ID. So this is helpful for a few different reasons. First, if you have this number, it's going to be the most efficient way to search for your client in HMIS. So for example, if you keep a record of the clients that you're working with and you jot down their HMIS ID, when you search for them, this will pull straight to their record rather than searching through names. More important than that, this is a great way to protect the client's information if you're ever having to coordinate with another agency. So I always felt much more comfortable using an HMIS ID if I was emailing outside of my agency to coordinate with, for example, mental health co-op. Maybe we are both working with Shanley. I would go ahead and use this ID rather than her name just as an added measure of privacy. Another thing that we will talk about here is that I think that they wanted this to look somewhat like a paper chart. So here you can see there are all these tabs, summary, client profile, etc. The one that is underlined green is the tab that you are in. So here you can see that we are in the summary tab of the client's record. I always recommend that you go left to right as a best practice for your data entry through these tabs, because they do build on each other and makes it a lot easier. You'll save a lot of time and headache if you go left to right. Again, these are meant to sort of build on each other and pull information forward as you go. This summary tab is a great way if you know, for example, maybe you were meeting with Shanley Test and you haven't met with her before, and you pull up her record. This is going to give you a great snapshot of what's going on and what's already in HMIS. This is obviously very blank and bare right now because we haven't actually added any information. So we'll circle back to this once we've added more info so you can see what's there. We are going to start then with the client profile tab. This is primarily used for recording client demographics. We've got contact information, case notes, and file attachments. So we're going to start at the top and go all the way through, and I'll show you how to start adding that information. We're keeping our eye out for these little pencils. This is how you're going to open the section that you want to add information into, the sub-assessments, as I mentioned before. So as I click on this pencil, the client record section, sub-assessment, if you will, is going to pull up. And again, that's just right on top of the main record. Visually, again, tricky for me. So Shanley Test is the name that we've already added. And the next question here, you're going to see these data quality questions a few times. This is going to give you the ability to identify whether you received full piece of information, partial. Then you also have the ability to say that the client didn't know the answer, that they refused, or data was not collected. We really want to stay away from data not collected as often as possible, because this essentially looks like the question was not asked. So if the client refuses or doesn't know, that is perfectly within their right. So I always recommend you lean towards these options rather than saying data not collected. So this is here because of the nature of the work that we all do. Oftentimes rapport is very necessary before people are willing to share their information with us. So sometimes someone might say, you know, my nickname is Shan. That's really all I'm willing to tell you right now. That's totally fine. We would just simply put Shan and then add that this was partial information reported. Everything in HMIS is client report. So even if you have the client's birth certificate sitting in front of you and it says their name is Francis and they said, my name is Shanley, you're gonna go with what the client told you. Their information is their own and they have the right to share whatever they want in HMIS. In this instance though, this was a full name, so we're gonna go ahead and identify it as that. Next, we've got this alias box, which serves a couple different purposes. First, this is one of the ways that we can help a client who is really not comfortable with their information being in here to protect that. So if they are not comfortable at all with the name being in here, but they want to say, you can call me Jingle Bells. I don't know where that came from, but maybe that's their alias. You can put Jingle Bells in here and leave the name blank. The other way I've seen this used is that if their legal name is Shanley Test, but they go by Shan, you can indicate that as well. So that's just sort of more like a nickname or a preferred name. Social Security number, you want to add as much information as you can. If you're working with a person that does not have a Social Security number, we recommend you do something like 000s or 111, something to make it clear that this was not an actual Social Security number. You could also, I believe, leave it blank. I don't think it'll force you to add anything. And then again, we have this data quality, so we'll say that this was a full Social Security number reported. Once you add a Social Security number, you are then only able to edit the last 4 of that number. And really only people that are identified as the agency agency point of contact at your agency are able to edit the full social. So it's important to know who your agency's point of contact is if you were ever needing to update that piece of information. And last here is your client a veteran? We'll say no in this instance, but make sure to say yes if the client reports that. Now, when we save, we can see all of the information here is now properly recorded on the client record or client profile tab. We're going to move on to the client demographics section and add the relevant information. We're going to say this is a full date of birth. So gender is going to give you the ability to identify multiple genders. So the client has the ability to identify maybe they're questioning and female, or transgender and male, or just female, whatever the case may be. You just simply need to click on the control button before you select multiple options. Okay. Client's primary and secondary race. This part's tough for me because we're working sort of within the confines of what the federal government gives people as options here. So we've heard that this would be a literal act of Congress to extend and make this list more comprehensive. So for this example, I again always like to emphasize the ability for a client to answer refuse if the answer here is not reflective for them in terms of race or ethnicity. So you'll answer whatever it is that they say. This is the ability to add another race if the client wants to identify one is not weighted more importantly than the other, so it does not matter which order you put them. And then ethnicity, again, really not comprehensive. So again, they can always refuse if this is not reflective. And we're gonna save. Okay. Any questions about anything here so far? Alrighty, moving on to, yeah.
Oh, no, I was saying I have no questions.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks. Okay, moving on to contact information, and I really cannot emphasize this enough. So one example for why this is so important is that last year or 2 years, time really runs together, when the ESG CV grant came into our community and we had a big rush of new resources, we had a lot of people being referred to these programs, and we did not have an up-to-date contact option for them. And we really hate for that to be the last barrier there to move someone into housing. So anytime that you can update this, anytime that a phone number changes or anything like that, we really ask you to sort of be diligent in this way so that we can always get in touch with folks. So I'm going to click add. And as you can see, there's a lot of different options for contact information. If you are doing street outreach and this person is someone that you met in a specific part of town that you want to identify, you can list that. If they have an address, maybe like a mailing address they receive mail at, you could list this. Phone number is obviously great, but as we know, this is oftentimes changing. Phones ran out of minutes or they lost it or whatever the case may be. So this is the one we really ask you to stay on top of updating anytime that you find out a number has changed. And then we're not above Facebook messaging someone for a resource. So if they have a social media handle that they're comfortable with sharing or an email address, that's another avenue as well. So this is the first example where we see the importance of the backdate mode or timestamp. So essentially that whole thing serves as to tell us when information was verified to be true. So in this case, we said that this information was verified on 2/10, and this is the first time we can see that reflected in the workflow. The other thing you can see here is an end date, and that's going to be another thing we see several times in the rest of this workflow. Most of the time, end dates are not going to be something you're proactively adding. This would be usually used after the fact. So maybe someone that's already been in HMIS, maybe their income changed. So the end date would be used to signify the end of a type of income before you add a new one. So in this case, this is not relevant to add an end date, so we're just going to simply leave it blank. Okay, so now we have what we entered here visible on the main profile tab. Emergency contact looks very similar to the last sub-assessment. So you'll add, this is really for the purpose of a true emergency. So I know sometimes clients might say, just add yourself. You're already gonna be sort of associated with the client when you do that data entry. So this would be someone, a friend, a contact, a family member, whoever would be the client's preferred emergency contact. This is not required, so they can certainly opt out of adding this. But if they would like someone on file, you can add that information and save. Okay, client notes. This is, I would say, one of the most important collaboration tools that we have access to through HMIS. This is our opportunity as a community to share information and context about a person's scenario and make sure, one, we're easing the burden of the client's need to keep telling their story over and over to many people. We can sort of work together to put those really important pieces here in HMIS and all be sort of collaborating around this client note section. So we're going to circle back to this too at the end. Once we've sort of built out our scenario, we'll add a client note so you can see what is helpful information to add. So we're going to move on for now to the file attachment spot. This is another really, really helpful tool that we have. File attachments, this is something that we can use to store our clients' birth certificate, social security cards, IDs, proof of income, those main documents that are usually required for receiving mainstream resources. This is a great spot to keep a copy of those things. The reason that this is so helpful, as I'm sure you've heard or seen or experienced working with this population, is that those documents tend to be very vulnerable to weather conditions. Maybe a backpack is stolen or misplaced or damaged or whatever the case may be. We have seen endless examples of how having these documents saved here prevents new barriers from forming when you're working towards specific resources for your client. So to add a file attachment, you're going to click Add New File Attachment. You're going to need to have saved the file somewhere on your computer. We'll add a random document here. And then the naming convention we ask that you use is last name underscore first name underscore what is this document, and we'll pretend this is the ID. The reason that we ask folks to name it this way is because people that have been in HMIS maybe multiple times or for many years might have like 20 or 30 documents. So rather than having to open and download 20 or 30 documents, this is a great way to sort of keep things organized and save you time in the future. Now, and moving forward, the quick way to look at this is to click on this little magnifying glass to open the document and access it. The last thing to note in this client profile tab is this up here in the top right corner, which is the opportunity to add a photo of the client. This is certainly not a requirement, but it has proven to be very useful for a couple different reasons. One is that there is a specific resource called a connector card, which is a 1-year Metro bus pass for anyone that is experiencing literal homelessness and is working with a housing navigator. No strings attached, 1-year bus pass. It's really awesome. And actually the photo that goes onto there is pulled straight from HMIS. Don't let that be a barrier though. If your client is really uncomfortable with the photo being in here, you can work with the HMIS CE team to email them the photo that they would want on there. So don't let that be a barrier. More importantly than that though, the opportunity to add this photo gives us as a community the ability to work together in instances where maybe a street outreach worker has lost contact with Shanley and is really worried. Maybe they had a physical health condition happening and they can't get in contact. This would be an opportunity in care coordination meetings to pull up the client's record and say, this is Shanley, has anyone seen her? Someone might say like, yeah, she's always at the library on Wednesdays, something like that. So that's come up many times and has been useful for that reason. Okay, we've come to the end of the client profile tab. You can see down here that you have the ability to save. It does and should auto save as you go. I like to click it just in case. So I always do that at the end of each page or tab. Okay, let's move on, if there are no questions, to the household tab. And as I switch, let me know if you have any questions. Okay, welcome to,
I'm sorry. Well, you probably already mentioned this, but I have a memory of a goldfish. Is the social media tab even necessary, or is it optional?
For the contact information?
Yeah.
Yeah, none of this is required. So really, we're just asking for as much information that the client is comfortable sharing in order to reach them for resources or care coordination or anything like that. So it's certainly not required, but if the client, maybe they only have a Facebook, this would be a way just to make sure that people looking for and working with the client has that avenue to reach them.
Okay, awesome.
Great, good question, thanks. Okie dokie, moving on to the household tab. This is going to give us the ability to document a household if the person that you're working with is in a household. That's not always going to be the case. If you're working with an individual, you're going to skip this tab altogether. So this is truly only going to be if the client has identified that they want to work towards housing with someone else. So for the purpose of HUD, the Federal Housing Authority, and HMIS, a household is going to be however the group of people identifies as a household. So that could be a parent-child, it could be like a traditional married couple, or it could be 2 friends or 3 cousins or whatever the case may be. If a group of people says, we want to work towards housing together, that is your household definition. So as you can see, there's no information here, and obviously that's because we just created this brand new record. But we do want to also add Shanley's child to HMIS. So we are going to click Start New Household. And this may be familiar to you. This is the same client search screen that we used to create Shanley's record. The one small addition up here at the top being household type. This covers a lot, but it's not 100% comprehensive. So other is here if the composition of your household does not reflect. In this case, we're going to identify it as a female single parent household, and we are going to search for Shanley's child. So again, this is grayed out, forcing us to make sure Luna doesn't already exist. Down here, we can see Shanley is already a selected member of the household. And up here, we're seeing no matches, meaning Luna is not currently in HMIS. So now we can add the new client. Again, this is making sure for the 3rd time, essentially, that we haven't bypassed a potential existing record. Great, so we have now officially created Luna a record in HMIS. This feels sometimes like a loophole because we're currently adding information for Shanley. We might forget that we have now actually created an official record. We can now see Luna has her own HMIS ID number. I say this to say that it will be really important to keep that in mind for later because you will need to go back and add any required data elements for additional household members as well. I will also recommend to you that a best practice workflow is to go all the way through your head of household information before you add additional information for your additional household members. And I found for me personally that that was the best way to keep things organized and not to accidentally miss anything as I jumped between records. So I do recommend you keep on pushing through the head of household record. So I'm going to click continue now that I've got my whole household identified. And on this next screen, we are talking primarily about who the head of household is. So in this instance, we have a pretty straightforward scenario because we only have one adult, so one person above the age of 18. So we're going to identify Shanley as the head of household, and you can see this just auto-selected self as the relationship to head of household. And now we want to identify Luna's relationship to the head of household as daughter. So again, this is pretty comprehensive, but other is also here for you, other relative or other non-relative. And over here on the right, we see again the importance of that backdate mode or timestamp. So this is saying that as of 2/10, we could verify this was the way that the household identified together. So there we go. That is the last little piece of this household section. So we're going to click Save and Exit. And now back out on the main household tab, we can see the composition of the household we've just created. So we've got a female single parent household with the 2 members listed here. We have supplemental information posted on our website for how to handle if a household composition were to change. So maybe Shanley, later in your time with her, identifies she now has a partner. You can simply click this Manage Household button to add or delete household members. So if you wanted to remove someone, you could click this Leave Household button. Or if you wanted to add someone, you could click on this and do the same process we just did with Luna. So if that scenario were to come up in your workflow, you can refer to our Weebly site and look at that supplemental information. One question that I get on a fairly regular basis is about custody issues. So a person needs to have at least 50% custody of a minor child for them to be listed here in HMIS. So until that's the case, you would not list a minor child if the head of household does not have at least 50% custody. Lots of very unique household scenarios come up. You can always, again, reach out to the HMIS help desk if you have a scenario pop up and you're not quite sure how to document it. Before we move on to the release tab, any questions about household? Okie dokie. Okay, I will admit this is a little bit wonky and I'll explain why. This is what I would say, not the most straightforward part of the whole workflow. I would like to give you a little bit of background about the release of information and confidentiality in our community. For many, many years, HMIS was called a closed system. So essentially, information that was added into HMIS was only accessible again by the agency that added it. So maybe you met with Shanley as a street outreach worker and you documented everything here. And then someone from Mental Health Co-op also interacted with Shanley. They unfortunately, back in the day, way back in the day, could not see each other's information. That was really sad and lame for us because it eliminated our ability to coordinate and collaborate. It also really added a lot of time to data entry. Now, and as of August of 2020, our community has what we call a shared system. Essentially what that means is that information added by one agency is auto set to share with all of the other agencies. There are scenarios where that's not the case. It might be because the client opted out of data sharing, which in that case, we have other supplemental information about how to lock down clients' information. The other time where that's not the case is if an agency has decided that a program should not be shared. The one instance where that's happening now is with the OASIS Center data. So OASIS Center works with minor children. And for that reason, that whole program is totally locked down, meaning that you could not see the information about the minor children. So at the time that we approved data sharing as a community, we did sort of have to come up with a creative way to document our release of information and to add a certain amount of diligence to make sure that we're all protecting that information the same way, since it's now being shared amongst up to 41 participating agencies. So in real life, working with the client, you will be going over the release of information with them. This is something that will be part of your follow-up homework, if you will, to pull up the release and spend a good amount of time reading it and making sure that you really understand what it says, so that you can make sure that the clients you're working with also really understand what they are signing on to. So once that's been done, you'll either have collected a signed statement or verbal consent, And in HMIS, this is what we call electronically tagging the release. So again, in real life, you've collected that in person or over the phone, whatever the case may be. And here we are adding it so that we can verify and signal to the other agencies interacting with this record that we have permission to do that. So I'm going to click Add Release of Information. One thing to point out before we tackle the release is that we're now going to start to see the household that we just added showing up throughout the rest of the workflow like this at the top. So now that we've added Luna, we can group clients together, members of the same household, and that's going to save us time in the data entry process. So for documenting releases of information, every adult, so anyone 18 years of age and older, will need to verify their own information and give permission for that to be entered. Minor children will be tagged as part of the head of household's release and signed for by them. So you can either select clients manually through here, or if you're selecting the whole household, you can click this button to tag everyone that way. Okay, so this is the one little piece of the workflow that I think is not super intuitive, but the provider listed here, this is the coordinated entry provider. So that's the first time we see the importance of setting our EDA mode. That is saying that the release was granted under the coordinated entry provider. The one extra step here, we're going to click search. This is where this universal ROI provider comes in handy. So this provider was set up to be visible by any user in HMIS. So I mentioned visibility in regards to the OASIS program. Regardless of all that, we all have access to this line or provider here. So we always want to make sure that any user can see the release of information on file. Hopefully this makes more sense when you get in here and get to practice it for yourself. But I am simply going to add this one universal ROI to the list of providers we're tagging in the ROI section. I'm exiting back to this last screen we just saw, and now we can see both of the providers listed here. The most important and required one is this universal ROI. The rest is very straightforward. Was a release granted, yes or no? If a release was not granted, you are still able to add information, but at that point, you do have to take the next step and lock down the record at the project level. So that's just something for now to theoretically understand. And again, if you ever run into that where a client doesn't sign a release or doesn't want to have their data shared, you'll need to refer to that or reach out to the HMIS desk just to make sure you understand how to do that. We're going to say yes. Our release is valid for 3 years. So we'll identify that here. Unless a client signifies or recognizes a shorter time frame, that's going to be the automatic one you'll identify. Was the information in the release collected as a signed statement or verbal consent? So before COVID, we were not doing verbal consent really at all, but obviously we know that things have changed and this is just fine to collect a verbal consent for data sharing. Your process with the client will not change. So you will still very much go through the release and make sure they understand it. If your client is giving verbal consent, you're still going to sign the ROI as the witness, and in the client signature spot, you will say verbal consent granted on whatever day. So we'll say signed statement from client, and then we are going to sign as the witness. I'm shadowing Ashley, so I'm going to say that it was Ashley who did this witness. Now I'm going to click Save Release of Information and back out on the main ROI tab. You can see that's underlined green. We're in that tab. You can see now that the release of information has been tagged. The very last step here is to actually physically upload the release so that if another agency were to come into this client's record, they would also be able to see the releases here. So you only need to do this if you are the first person adding the person into HMIS. If one is already on file and still within that active time frame, you are covered under that release. So I'm going to exit. Hopefully you can see this. Now there's a tiny little one, and this will show you that there is a file attachment here. Any questions about anything in the Release of Information tab before we move on? Okie dokie. Well, we are cruising right along, and I think we're on track still to be wrapping up by 3. What we have done so far is what I would call the foundation of the client's record. So this is now going to be mostly information that won't change over time. Some pieces will, like contact information. Maybe the household composition will change, and maybe you'll need to update the ROI. But for the most part, this is kind of the stuff that is fundamental and foundational for the client's record. As we move into this entry exit tab, this is where we really dive into the programmatic side of documenting in HMIS. So I'm going to click over here. This shows that the client is not currently enrolled in anything. And again, obviously that's because we just created the record. But if you're working with someone that's already in HMIS, this is where you would see any programs that they're receiving services from. So maybe you see that they're working with the Salvation Army Street Outreach Program. Maybe you'll see they're also already in coordinated entry, or maybe they're enrolled in Centerstone's Critical Time Intervention Program. Whatever the case may be, you'll see that they're either actively working with someone, or if there's an exit date listed, you'll see that they once had worked with that agency. So this is where we're going to add that the client needs access to resources. We want to document them in the coordinated entry process. So I'm going to click Add Entry Exit. Again, this is where we definitely want to make sure that we're saying that the whole household is entering coordinated entry together. They want to work towards housing together. The provider here is automatically going to match whatever the EDA mode you entered earlier. So this is why, again, this is so important to make sure that this is correct early on. So the type here, this is a little arbitrary for y'all's sake, but when we set up different programs in HMIS, we have to associate it with one of these types. Oftentimes that's like, maybe it is HUD funded, and so we're using a HUD workflow, whatever the case may be. For coordinated entry, you're always going to select standard. Something notable here is that there's only ever going to be one correct type. So it's really hard to get it wrong. I'm going to show you though, maybe I accidentally selected HUD and I tried to move forward. Just so you know what this looks like, if you accidentally select the wrong type, there's just simply going to be nothing here. So if you ever see this and it says no entry assessment for this provider, that should signal to you that you accidentally selected the wrong type. So now that we update it with standard, which is the correct one, we will see all of our different assessments listed here and the assessment that we're going to enter information to listed here. So this is what you want to see as you're entering people into coordinated entry. So we're going to do another visual tour, and then we are going to take our 5-minute break. So up here at the top, we can see the household that we are entering into coordinated entry. Here we can see the 5 different assessments that are associated with coordinated entry. So you can see this is slightly grayed out. The preliminary assessment is what you will answer when you're entering someone into the coordinated entry process. The CE update is what we call interim update, so that anytime you're working with the client after they've already been entered, this is your ability to add any changes to things like income, disabling conditions, etc. We'll talk more about that later. The exit, the VI SPDAT, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and then old case notes. So we saw earlier that there is a case note section on the client profile tab. Sort of back in the day, case notes used to be buried here in this assessment. So if there were old case notes from before that transition, they still live here. That's been over like a year and a half at this point. So anyone newer into HMIS, there's nothing here, but it'd be worth kind of clicking just to see if there are any old case notes here. Here on the left-hand side, again, we have a list of the household members. The blue one is going to be the record you're currently in. So as you can see, we're in Shanley's record. This is a quick way to switch between household members. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm always going to advocate that you go all the way through the head of household before you circle back to, in this example, Luna's record. I think it's much more organized. It makes a lot more sense, at least for my brain. If you find later that that's not what works best, you're welcome to play with it, but that is my recommendation. All righty. Here we have the CE preliminary assessment. So every question we're going to answer is part of the preliminary assessment. A lot of the questions in this assessment are also going to be similar to what you're answering if you're entering things for your grant or any other project. So maybe you're doing street outreach. A lot of these questions will be the same. One thing that's very important is are these red section headers. So this is going to tell you for which household members you'll need to add the information for. So this first one says complete for all household members. So this would be another mental note just to sort of remember that I will eventually need to circle back to Luna because it looks like this information is required for her as well. Okay, any questions about anything before we take our break? Okay, well, it is 2:11. We're going to reconvene right at 2:16 and keep on moving forward. So take a few minutes and I'll see you guys right at 2:16. Okay, and we're back at 2:16. Hopefully you all are settling back in. We are going to pick up right where we left off. Give me 1 second to share my screen again. Okay, back in the preliminary assessment, which just as a reminder is what we are answering to enter someone into the coordinated entry process. I haven't mentioned this yet, but although we're just sort of talking about the workflow for coordinated entry, it's really important that you also have attended what we call the coordinated entry resource and referral training. This is something you'll have seen on your new user checklist. This is sort of the sister training, and it is all about coordinated entry, resources available in the community, and how to actually connect your clients to those resources. So although we're really focused on the workflow itself, make sure that you have reached out to the coordinated entry team for that information as well. If you're not sure who that is, make sure you reach out to the HMIS help desk and we can get you connected. Okay, so we're going to, again, pay attention to these red section headers. This is saying complete for all household members. So we're going to start going through and answering these questions. Excuse me. So first here, we've got relationship to head of household. We are, again, still in Shanley's record, so we're going to say self. That might feel repetitive because we already identified this on the head of household tab. But there are some very rare instances where the normal, like head of household is not going to be the primary person being served by a program. Again, Oasis Center comes to mind where maybe there is an adult member of the household, but they are, for this program, receiving the service very specifically. So anyways, just to note that. Anything that we have already answered is going to be pulling forward for us here. So that's what I was talking about earlier about the workflow building on itself. So anything we've already got is going to be listed here. People ask me about these little green rectangles, and if you click on them, it will tell you who added the information, what date it was collected, and what provider they entered it from. So that's sort of one added little measure of coordination. You can see who was working with the client at that point when the information was collected. These actually do change color over time from green to yellow, orange, red, brown, black. And that the darker it gets is supposed to help you visualize how long the information has been in there, so they get darker over time. That could mean they need an update, but not always, but that's what's happening there. Okay, next step here, we've got disability information. And the structure of this question is going to be one that we see a few more times. So we've got the question itself, we've got an opportunity to add a type, and this thing called the HUD verification. So we're going to go through all three of those sections, and then we're going to see that same format several times. So does the client have a disabling condition? Again, this is all client report. So even if you feel like you perceive one of these options, but the client says no, that's how you'll answer in HMIS. We do hope that, you're working to build a relationship to the point where the client is willing to share this information, but if that's just not the case at this time, that's just fine. You can always say no, or the client refused, etc. But we're going to say that Shanley said yes, and because she said yes, we also want to add then the type. So I'm going to click add. Again, we've got this sub-assessment. The disability type here, you've got lots of options, including other. We're going to say that Shanley identified mental health disorder. This disability determination is going to be based on the client's report. So we are not asking for a doctor's note or a disability awards letter or anything like that. If the client identified it, it has been determined true. So we're going to say yes, because Shanley told us that information. If yes, is it expected to be of long continued and indefinite duration and substantially impair their ability to live independently? We're going to say no based on the client's report. This is a somewhat outdated question. I would expect it to go away in the next couple of years. This does not ever prevent someone from accessing any specific resource, even if they were to say yes here. So just for everyone to know. Here again, we see the timestamp that we identified early in the workflow as our backdate mode. If you know a more specific start date for things like a disabling condition or income later, you're welcome to put it, but we're certainly not requiring that you identify the very start date of a client's mental health disorder. So as it reads, this is essentially saying that as of 2/10, we could verify this information to be true based on the client's report, and that is plenty. Note on disability, if I'm being very honest, I don't think people are adding many notes in these sub-assessments, so they're not incredibly useful at this time. And at this time, we're actually asking people not to include diagnostic information in HMIS. We prefer that you are doing that in your internal databases. That could certainly change in the future, but for now, we just think HMIS is maybe not the best place for that information. We are working with certain agencies that have customized workflows and created extra protections within their own workflows. So if you wanted to customize a workflow and add things like diagnostic information that's not been shared to other agencies, we can certainly do that. So just a side note there as well. This next question is actually retired, and for whatever reason, we cannot delete it, so we just simply added the word retired. And then the end date, again, in this scenario, that's not relevant, and so we're going to leave it blank and click Save. Okay. If the client had identified an additional disabling condition, you would click Add again and go through that process with whatever other disabling condition they identify. And last but not least, this is called the HUD verification. And this is essentially a quick way to say that you did ask all of these questions to the client. You went through this list. They said yes to mental health disorder. And then if I click no, we're going to see everything else that we didn't already touch on, auto select to no. This is what we call the HUD verification. It's proving our diligence and asking the question completely. So this is very exciting, what's about to happen. This just turned to a green check mark. Warms my soul. I have been personally triggered by this little red triangle for many years, and you will be too in the future. This is particularly important and relevant in anything that you're doing for the purpose of grant documentation, because if you do not select this, it will pull into your reports as a data quality error. So it's really important to just get in the habit of always making sure that these red triangles are always these gorgeous green check marks. I'll pause here if there are any questions. Okay, moving on to health insurance. So is the client covered by health insurance? We'll say yes, which means we will need to add the type. If there's a rare or unique health insurance type, we'll say that this is an employer provided health insurance. And yes, they are currently covered. HOPWA is well, we do have StreetWorks on the call. So HOPWA is a supplemental insurance that is offered to people living with HIV or AIDS. So many times this might not apply, but if it does, you can indicate it here. And we're gonna save. And last but certainly not least, we want to get that really gorgeous green check mark by saying no, the client doesn't get the rest of those types. And once you do that, you can see that everything was time stamped with a yes or a no. So the type we said yes to early on is listed here, and then everything else is indicated as not being received by the client. If the client answered yes to being a veteran, this is asking if they received services through the TVHS. So you would ask that question if your client had said that they were a veteran. Next up, we've got the pregnancy information, and this is super important. So if you are familiar with coordinated entry, or you will soon be once you receive the referral and resource training, coordinated entry is all about prioritizing the most vulnerable people in our community for resources first. So we do not believe in a first come, first served model of connection. We want to make sure that the most vulnerable are connected first. Pregnancy is actually a category that we prioritize, and that's because people who have just had a child, there is very little available to people if they have a 2-week-old or younger. At this time, the Women's Mission does not allow people that have a 2-week-old or younger stay there. So we prioritize any person that is pregnant in their 3rd trimester. So if your client is pregnant, we do ask you to answer this, and we ask that anyone that could be biologically pregnant that you answer this question too. So is the client pregnant? Yes or no? We'll say no, but if they did say yes, make sure you add that projected birth date. We've come to another red section header, which says complete for the head of household and all adults. So we are going to keep on answering questions. So this is what we call the homeless history questions, and this is how we understand for how long a person has experienced homelessness. And the point is really to help us understand if the person is experiencing chronic homelessness, meaning that they have been outside or in a shelter for more than 1 consecutive year, or that they have experienced multiple episodes of homelessness in a short time period. So the first question here is called the prior living situation. Always refer to the little notes that we've added because they'll help you understand the question. If you're not sure, prior living situation refers to where the client stayed the night before the assessment. So Shanley said that last night she was staying in a car, so that's going to be a place not meant for habitation. This list here is one that you'll see at least one more time in this workflow. So I do recommend that you pause here and really acquaint yourself. This is another list that's really filled with acronyms. So I recommend you pause here and kind of get acquainted with what this list has to offer, and make sure that you're always selecting the most appropriate and accurate answer. Coordinated entry is typically going to be for people that are experiencing literal homelessness. So that's oftentimes going to mean that you're really selecting from these top 2 options. So place not meant for habitation, so car in this example, or an emergency shelter, which also includes a hotel or a motel if it's paid for with an emergency shelter voucher. Essentially, if a nonprofit or charitable organization is paying for it, it is considered an emergency shelter. Okay, if you select one of these homeless situations, as it's called here, we've got a couple other questions that logically just pulled as part of the workflow. So the next question is, how long did the person stay in this place they were last night? So how long have they been there? We're going to say that Shanley said that her and her daughter have been in the car for about 4 months. So we're going to answer 90 days or more, but less than a year. So the approximate date started for this episode of homelessness. Okay, now I have to do math. I set myself up for failure. October, don't judge me if that's wrong. We'll say it's like roughly October is when the client identified she started or began experiencing homelessness. Regardless of where they stayed last night, how many times or how many number of times has the client been on the streets or in an emergency shelter in the past 3 years, including today? We're going to say that Shanley identified that last year and the year before she experienced homelessness at different times, which is a grand total of 3 times or 3 episodes, as you'll hear people call it. And then the last question in this section is the total number of months that the person has experienced homelessness in the past 3 years, including this episode. So let's say Shanley said each time it lasted about 4 to 5 months. So adding all of those up together, we've got more than 12 months. This set of questions is oftentimes a little bit tricky. People don't always document this kind of information, and so maybe they don't know the exact start date, and that's just fine. We're doing the best we can to help them document the most amount of homelessness that we can help them document. Chronic homelessness is another category that we do prioritize for resources, because what we know based on all sorts of research is that people that have been outside longer tend to be more vulnerable. So that is really the root of this section here. Your best guesstimate is oftentimes the best we can do here, working with whatever the client's giving you and documenting the best that you can. Any questions about that before we move on? Alrighty, moving on then to the income information. Does the client receive income? We're going to say yes. We're going to say the client is working part-time, making about $1,500 a month. Now that we've said yes, we also again want to add a type. It's a pretty long list of options. Other two, if you have something that's not on the list. Receiving income, yes. Monthly amount for this type of income, again, is $1,500. The reason that feels a little repetitive is this here is going to give you the opportunity to add multiple types of income, and this should be the grand total. So maybe the client also received whatever else. You could add each of them separately, and this should be the grand total. And then always HUD verification. So the client does not receive any of these other types. So we're going to say no. And that will give us that HUD verification. Non-cash benefits. We're going to say Shanley said no for this one. So in this instance, there's nothing to add, but we still do always want to HUD verify. So in this case, we just simply did not say yes to any, but we still, again, want to HUD verify. Moving on to the domestic violence history questions. So the first question is the client a survivor of domestic violence? The wording there got tricky for me at a point, but this is asking, has the person ever experienced domestic violence? And we're going to say Shanley said no. But this is where I always emphasize the importance of knowing what to do internally at your agency if someone said, yes, I am actively fleeing domestic violence. Super important that you know your agency's policies and procedures for safety planning and resource sharing in that instance. Okay, moving on to the current living situation. This, I might say, is the most important data element in this workflow. So I'm going to be annoying again about explaining it. So the current living situation, the first time you're creating a record, it's going to feel a little bit similar to what we just answered in the homeless history questions. The difference there is that the homeless history questions help us understand for how long a person has been homeless or experienced homelessness, and this is going to help us figure out where they are right now. So whereas the history won't change, the current living situation oftentimes will. As people move maybe from a shelter to the car to a friend's house, this will give us an idea of the movement of the client. Also important because certain current living situations will prioritize people for resources. So someone that is literally homeless is going to be prioritized over someone that is, for example, couch surfing at their family's house. So we are going to add a current living situation. Actually, before I move on, make sure you read this note the first few times that you add info. The other reason that this question is so important is because this is how we identify clients that should or should no longer be open in coordinated entry. So as a bare minimum, we ask that this current living situation question be added by someone in the community every 90 days. As a best practice, and the direction we're sort of moving is that anytime a service provider can verify the current living situation, that we're adding this. Again, because that's always going to restart your 90-day clock before someone is exited from coordinated entry. But it also gives us a really good idea about how much interaction is happening with that client. So super, super important that you're on top of this anytime you talk with a client, that you go ahead and re-verify where they are now. So we're going to click add. And again, this is going to feel just a little bit repetitive because we just answered some of these questions a moment ago. Information date will match your current living situation start date most of the time. Current living situation, again, this is where are they now? Shanley said in the car. Area of town, so if we're going to say we interacted with Shanley at the Walmart parking lot in South Nashville. And then this here is the client going to have to leave their current living situation within 14 days. This is really set up for diversion. So if someone is experiencing a housing crisis, maybe they have an eviction notice, but they, have X amount of days, you could say yes here and then answer the following questions. To be very honest, we have very few diversion services available in Nashville. This is more so where we lean on providers to help reconnect them to their own personal network. But that's what that question is. We are going to click save, and now we can see the first of many current living situations documented here. Moving along to a next red section header, completing for the head of household only. So we're going to keep on going. We've got the client location. So I mentioned earlier the continuum of care, and that is exactly what this is referring to. The entire United States is broken up into more than 400 different continuums of care or geographic regions that are working together to prevent and end homelessness. And ours is given this code TN Tennessee 504. So we made that note so you don't ever really have to think about it. And it also just happens to be the first one on the list. Agency collecting the information is Park Center, we're going to say. And then the next question is asking, where did the CE intake take place? So that might be repetitive. So maybe the person came into Park Center, and in that case, you would answer this the same way. But the reason it's there twice is because if I from Park Center collected information, but I did it in the South Nashville parking lot, Walmart parking lot, then this would give me the ability to document them separately. So we're going to, again, just say, okay, well, South Nashville's not here. We're going to say, we'll say South Nashville camp or street. These next two questions are really important because they're going to help you know whether or not after you complete the preliminary assessment, if you'll move on to complete the VI SPDAT. So that's an acronym that I mentioned earlier. There's a lot more context and information that you'll need to know before you actually do a VI SPDAT. That is actually posted on our website at this time, so definitely important that you do that. The VI SPDAT is what we currently use in our community as a vulnerability index survey. Many of you may have heard that we are consulting to figure out a better way to document and understand clients' vulnerability. There have been nationwide understanding that this is not the best tool anymore. For now, it is the tool that we use, but we again are currently working with a consulting firm to try to figure out a better local tool for this. Pardon me while I sip some water. Excuse me. So the next two questions will tell you if you go on to do the VI SPDAT or not. Okay, give me a second while I cough. Sorry. Okay, so does the household want to work towards permanent housing? Shanley said yes. Does the household want assistance and or resources towards permanent housing? We'll say yes. In the instance someone says no, you're actually not going to then move on to do the VI SPDAT. The VI SPDAT is all about prioritizing for housing resources. And if the client has not identified that as a goal, then there's no reason to move forward and do that step. Oftentimes, what we know to be true is that there are certain barriers in the way of someone saying yes at the maybe first or second time they've interacted with a caseworker. We hope that over time in your developing a relationship with the person that you can address their barriers to wanting to move towards permanent housing, and that eventually they might say yes in the future. And at that time, you could update this and move forward in the process with the VI SPDAT. We have reached the bottom of the preliminary assessment. Huzzah. This last question here is an admin only question. So this is how the coordinated entry team tracks referrals that are made on behalf of the client. So you don't need to add anything here, but you will start to see information populate about referrals that are being made through coordinated entry. I'm going to click save, and I'm full disclosure a little worried about the 3 o'clock time frame. We might go 5 minutes over. Let me know now if that's a big concern, or you can plan to watch the recorded version of this when it comes out. I guess just hop off at 3 if you need to hop off. Okay, I clicked save, but before we exit, this is where it's really important to remember our additional household members. So now is when I'm going to switch over to Luna's record, and I'm going to do this really fast just because it's all very much the same as what we just did for Shanley. But we want to go through and add all of the required information for additional household members. So we're adding the first section because it says complete for all household members. Disabling conditions, we'll say no, she has none. No, we still want to verify. Health insurance, we'll say no, not yet. Maybe they're working on it, or maybe you're going to be working on it with them. Great. It's obviously a child, but okay. And now we have reached our second second red section header, which says complete for head of household and all adults. Luna is not an adult, so we're going to keep on basically just scrolling past all of this till we reach our next one, which says for head of household only, which again, Luna is not. So now we have finally reached the end of the preliminary assessment. We're going to click save and exit. This here, back out onto the main entry exit tab, this is what we call an open entry, meaning that there is an entry date, but no exit date. So anytime you see this for coordinated entry or any other program, this is going to say, okay, 1 second, y'all. Okay, maybe my computer is going to force a restart. That's devastating. We're going to just keep on moving. So this all would show you that this person is currently open in coordinated entry if there's no exit date. So we are now going to say that it's been a few days that have passed and nope. We're going to say we met with the client again. And so in this case, now that the client's already entered and we're meeting with them again, anytime you meet with them now and moving forward, your work will be documented in what we call these interim updates, which you're looking to be right here in the interims. You're going to click on this little tiny icon under that. And we're going to click add interim review. Make sure everyone is selected and that this is selected as an update. There are certain grants that require these other time frame updates. So maybe you have to do an annual assessment if you are receiving grants. But for coordinated entry, we're just always going to select update. All right. Here we are in the update. This is sort of the joy and purpose of what I mentioned earlier. Data sharing is going to always give to you the most recently added information as a starting point when you're adding data. So in this case, everything that we added in the entry is pulling forward for us in the update as a starting point. So if maybe the only thing that has changed is that the client, let's say, has food stamps now, we are going to leave everything else as it was, and we are simply going to update this section here. So we're going to say that Shanley now does have food stamps. We're going to add that. We're going to say her and Luna are receiving $150 in food stamps, and we'll save. Great. So we're now documenting that a couple days later, that change has been made. As a best practice, anytime I can verify where the client is now, we want to do that. So even though it's only been 2 days and the client is still in the car at the Walmart parking lot, we want to also go ahead and update this here. This might, though, be maybe Shanley and Luna are now at the Women's Mission. You could update that as well to be reflective of whatever is true. Great. So this now shows both current living situations. This just restarted that 90-day clock, and we are good to go. So before we leave, I do want to just quickly show you where the VI SPDAT is. Again, you're going to need to refer to the supplemental information on our Weebly about the VI SPDAT. But just so you know where to access it, it is listed here as the assessment. You can either do it when you enter someone into coordinated entry or in an interim update. So I think most people's workflow is that they do it all at the entry just to kind of get it all done and in there. So here we've got 3 different VI SPDATs. Definitely make sure you know what each of them are. There's little notes here, but again, that supplemental training is going to be really important. In this case, we're doing the family assessment because we have a minor child. So I'm going to click add. We're not going to go through all of this right now, but this is where you would add information for the VI SPDAT and click save. This is saying like, hey, you forgot every question. In real life, you would want to make sure to go back and add anything you missed. Oops. And then here it will show you that a VI SPDAT has now been added. The grand total will give you their vulnerability score, and the higher it is, the more vulnerable the tool has assessed them to be. Once the VI SPDAT has been completed, they are placed from there onto our community's by name list. And that is, again, all used to prioritize and match people to available resources. The very last step here is to do sort of what we did with the release of information. So this is how we tag that the VI SPDAT has been completed. So we're going to click add here. The assessment location, maybe the client was at Park Center, it was in person. The assessment level, so again, the VI SPDAT is used in our community as a housing needs assessment. And so that is what you will select anytime you do that. And then the prioritization status, the VI SPDAT, again, is used to put people onto the by name list. So once that's been completed, they are placed on the prioritization list. And then we wait forever for it to load. Okay, there we go. All right, I'm going to save and exit, and we have now completed an interim update. So just to sort of show you what we have here so far, we have information that was timestamped for 2/10. This is always now going to reflect what was true at the time the person was entered into coordinated entry. And then over here, we have 1 interim update. So again, we see that little tiny 1 here. If you click it, you'll then be able to access what was true on 2/12 when the person was updated. That, I think, that concept takes people a little bit of time to wrap their heads around. Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Okay. Well, the last step here, we're going to exit the person from coordinated entry. Let's say it is now current day, and this person has now been referred through coordinated entry to a rapid rehousing program. So we're going to set this for 2/17, and we are now going to click on the pencil by the exit date. A person should only be exited from coordinated entry for a few reasons. One, they're permanently housed, or two, they are exiting coordinated entry for whatever reason. Maybe it's because no one has contacted them in more than 90 days. Maybe it's because they moved out of state, or maybe they're no longer interested in working towards housing. Whatever the case may be, you have really only two options here. CE inactive, which covers a whole bunch of reasons, or they're permanently housed. Luckily for us today, we get to document a permanent housing placement. So we'll select that as our option. And then for the destination, so this is where we see that list another time. Hopefully and ideally, they're exiting to a permanent housing destination. That's not always going to be the case, but it's the ideal scenario. Make sure, again, you spend some time acquainting yourself. In this scenario, we're going to say that this client is exiting to a rental by client with a rapid rehousing or equivalent subsidy. You can add a note if you want to. Maybe it's like TSA's rapid rehousing program. And then if there is a subsidy, this has public housing, Section 8, shelter plus care, or other in this case for rapid rehousing. We're going to save and continue. And then this is our opportunity to essentially leave the record in good standing. So again, this is going to show you anything that was most recently added. So this has everything here. This is where, if anything had changed since their last update, you could leave it here. If God forbid they were to re-enter this situation, the next person that interacts with them would have the most up-to-date information available. So here you can see, again, this is now the interim update pulling because it's most recently added. And down at the bottom, we now see these exit details. So this is the only extra information needed at the time of exit. So if they are exiting for inactivity, last known location, or if they are housed, is the individual connected to supportive services, and with who? With whom? I don't know. Okay, we're gonna save and exit, and we have now officially gone through the entire life cycle of the coordinated entry, data entry process. So we entered them. Later, we added an interim update to report a change. We also, at that point, documented the VIs for that, and then we exited them at the time that they were housed. A couple loose ends that I want to tie up, but before we do that, are there any questions? I know this is a ton of information, but any questions about anything you just saw, documenting CE, interim updates, exit, anything? All righty, then let's just wrap up. We are looking maybe pretty good for the 3 o'clock. This last tab here is really awesome for coordinating with other agencies. So this is our ability to tag if we are working with the person in any capacity. So this does not mean that you are the primary contact for a client. And it certainly doesn't mean that you are now the only person that can work with the person. Really, this is saying, like, if in any way you could be called to coordinate around this client's care, please add yourself. So to do that, we're going to click Add Case Manager. We want to associate ourselves with both of the members of the household. And you can either click Me, which will pull in your contact information, or you can click Other and manually type in if another case manager at your agency will be that sort of touch point or contact info. It's a little bit more manual, but it is available in that scenario. As you can see, just the email address is added here. Up in the top right corner when you log in, so I'm Shanley, so it's got my name here. This tiny little settings icon will, if you click on it, give you the ability to add a phone number. So if you're willing to add like a work cell or a work phone, that's obviously going to be awesome for collaborating too. Okay. And again, there's no limit to how many case managers can be tagged here, and it certainly does not mean that you're the primary or only person working with the client. So don't let it deter you if you see another person's name. Do not assume that they're the only one working with them either. Okay, circling back to the summary tab, now that we've actually added information here, we can see a great snapshot of what's going on. So we've got quick reference info for demographics. We've got the household composition. We see that there's an active release of information on file. We see the programs that they are enrolled in or were enrolled in. And then we have hopefully contact information for any case managers who might be associated with this person as well. I want to really quickly talk about case notes. And it's, for time purposes, I'm not going to do a whole note, but case notes are, again, where you add some more context. So things that don't necessarily fall into the data elements we just saw. So maybe it's location, like client is staying in the Walmart parking lot in South. Maybe client wants to work towards housing, but needs a birth certificate. Let's see, wants to, I guess I am typing it out. Wants to increase income and connect with rapid rehousing. So stuff like that is really helpful. So where are they? What are their goals in terms of, you know, moving towards housing or anything else? And then maybe what are the barriers? So in this case, there is a birth certificate still needed. Maybe there's a back balance with MDHA or something like that. Any sort of tangible barriers that you can identify will save, again, the client from saying that over and over again, and other case managers in the future from having to like uncover that again as a barrier. So having that here as a collaborative resource is going to be really wonderful for the person that is experiencing homelessness. We do ask that you sign off with your name and from which agency you work at. This will help you know who wrote the case note, and then ideally this same person is also tagged as a case manager on the case manager tab or listed on the summary tab here. Whew, that was a lot. I just want to say congrats on making it through the HMIS user training. That is a ton of information, and I just want to make sure everyone knows that if that didn't all like totally click, that's fine and totally normal. This is a lot. It's a brand new software, a lot of context and things like that to learn as well. I said this in the beginning, but next steps will be different for those of you here and those of you watching this training in the future. For those of you here, I'm going to send an email to include the end user agreement and the link to the privacy and security training. Some of you have already done those things, and in that case, there's nothing else to do, but if you have not, please do that. For those of you watching this training in the future, you will have needed to email verification that you watched this training, that you signed the end user agreement, and that you've completed the privacy training. And once all of that has been collected, we will be able to send you your HMIS credentials. At that point, we are asking everyone to complete a test plan. For those of you here right now, I'm going to give you about a week. If you need more time, we're flexible, but if you need more time, just let us know. I say a week just while this is fresh on your brain to go ahead and practice it. I will be sending another email right after this with resources for data entry. There's a data entry manual which covers everything that you just saw, step-by-step instructions for how to enter data into HMIS and the coordinated entry workflow. It will also include test client instructions. So that's your, again, your opportunity to just practice everything. Write down questions, make sure things made sense. After that, you'll send confirmation and the test client name to the HMIS help desk, and you will meet with an HMIS team member to go over that and also to look at any other workflows that you might need access to. Again, that was a lot. If you're flustered or overwhelmed, we are here to support you. And by we, I mean PJ and Chantel. Are there any questions before we wrap up and go?
Yeah, how quick will we be able to, I guess, utilize this system? Because just by serendipity, I have a client that I was told that I must enter like ASAP. So
Okay. Yeah. So Trevor, as soon as I have all of the documents, and if you've already sent that, let's just coordinate offline. I can get that to you, and as soon as you can do the test client, you are sort of like in the clear to move forward. So that's going to just be based on how quickly you can add the test client.
awesome.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all so much. I accepted a position at Park Center, so I'm really not going very far. And although I won't get to work with you from this role, I hope to work with you all in the future. I'm around, so if you have any questions, let us know. The HMIS Help Desk email I'll send to you guys, along with a slew of other resources. So thank you all so much for all you do and for your willingness to participate in HMIS. We will be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.